Hi, this is Professor Patrick Martin again, and we're going to now conclude our discussion of fiscal policy. Before we start, however, we need to recall a discussion that we had back in Unit 4, where we wrote down an algebraic model in order to determine the equilibrium level of income in an economy. And so I want to reproduce that before talking about fiscal policy. And we're going to introduce a couple new elements into that older model to get a better idea on how the level of income in an economy can be changed by changes in government spending, one part of fiscal policy. So let's look at that old model. And there we had that the equilibrium level of income was equal to planned aggregate expenditure, which had several components. Consumption spending, which had two components. It had an autonomous component plus a component that depended upon the level of income. That was the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, times the level of income. So in total, these two terms comprise consumption spending. Planned investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. So these were our four spending components that we discussed earlier. And you might recall them from our expenditure decomposition of gross domestic product as well. We had these same four expenditure terms. If we take and we take the term involving income, that is marginal propensity to consume times income, and move it over to the left-hand side of the equation and then solve for y, we would find that the equilibrium level of income, I'll put a little e here as a subscript to denote equilibrium, is equal to all of the autonomous spending components that we have a bar above, divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so this was how we determined in Unit 4 the equilibrium level of income. Let me just make sure that that line's a little darker there. Back in Unit 4, we also asked the question as, what would happen if we increased government spending? And we calculated the change in the equilibrium level of income given a change in consumption in government spending as being equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. And we called this term on the right-hand side of this equation, we called this the government spending multiplier. And it told us by how much income would change with a $1 increase in government spending. Okay. Now, MPC is typically always between 0 and 1, so this whole term here is a number that's greater than 1. Okay. For example, if MPC was equal to 0.8, so that 80% of income was spent on consumption, then 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is 1 over 0.2, which is equal to 5. So the government spending multiplier would be equal to 5 in that case. So if the government increased spending by $5 billion, then the change in the equilibrium level of income would be $25 billion. Now I should point out that this change in the equilibrium level of income is only the change for a given price level. If we recall our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and I'm just going to draw a little picture of that down here with the price level P on the vertical axis and real GDP given by capital Y on the horizontal axis. What this government spending multiplier is telling us is by how much the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right at a given price level, okay, for a $1 increase in government spending. Okay, so this vertical distance, that's a horizontal distance between the two aggregate demand curves, is the amount that's given by the multiplier itself. So if we had a $1 billion increase in government spending, then the multiplier would tell us that this horizontal shift in the aggregate demand curve would be $5 billion if the marginal propensity to consume was 0.8, so that the multiplier was equal to 5, okay? So keep that in mind. The actual change in government spending, excuse me, the actual change in the equilibrium level of income is less than that. You know, why would that be? Because if the initial equilibrium level, put down y sub 0 for that, was at this point where aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersected one another, then that shift in the aggregate demand curve would establish the new equilibrium point at this point, okay, which is a smaller increase in the equilibrium level of income than would be predicted by the simple multiplier itself. And that's because the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, and we get changes in the price level as well. So we'll keep that in mind as we complicate this model when concluding our discussion of fiscal policy. So let's move over to the left-hand side of the screen here. And I'm going to make two changes in my planned aggregate expenditure equation. I'm going to introduce taxes, first of all. And taxes are going to be equal to a marginal tax rate, lowercase t, times income. And t, lowercase t, is a number between 0 and 1. So if you have paid 25% of your income in taxes, then t would be 0.25. The other change we're going to make is to net exports. We're going to make net exports equal to exports minus imports. Of course, that's the definition. But we're going to now take and make imports equal to the marginal propensity to import times income. Okay, and that makes sense. Our income level determines how many imports we buy. So in Canada, we purchase around 25 to 30% of what we consume are imported goods. So the marginal propensity to import would be around 0.25 or 0.3 in the Canadian economy. Other countries import less than we do here in Canada, and others import more. So in the US, the marginal propensity to import might be around 0.1 to 0.15 because they're a much larger economy and they don't import as high a percentage of goods consumed by households as we do here in Canada. So we're going to make these two changes. And so I'm going to rewrite this equation at the top. I'm going to leave out the AE for planned aggregate expenditure here. And let's see what we get. So we're going to get y equals C, upper bar, our autonomous spending component, depends upon wealth rather than income, plus the marginal propensity to consume. And we're going to multiply that by y minus ty. So this is income minus taxes. And we might call this disposable income, and we'll use a D subscript to refer to disposable. Okay. And then we have our other spending components as before, but now we're going to put in exports minus imports, where imports are equal to the marginal propensity to import times income. If we were to solve again for the equilibrium level of income, here's what we would get. And I would do that by moving all the terms involving y over to the left-hand side of this equation. I would get in the numerator, I would get these terms. And the denominator would look like this. So 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus the marginal tax rate, lowercase t, plus the marginal propensity to import. If I solve for the change in the equilibrium level of income that occurs with a change in government spending, and again, the change in government spending is what fiscal policy is all about. The government in an expansionary fiscal policy will increase government spending. If it's contractionary fiscal policy, if the economy is overheated, will reduce government spending. But that change in income, given a change in government spending, and I put down at a given price level. So at a particular price level P, remember this discussion we had over here, is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC times 1 minus the marginal tax rate, lowercase t, plus the marginal propensity to import. If we compare these two multipliers, okay, this multiplier is going to be larger, 1 over 1 minus MPC, than when we include taxes and we make imports dependent upon income. This multiplier over here, and on the left in pink, is going to be much smaller than the multiplier and the prediction of how income changes with the increase in government spending. In both cases, the actual change in government's in the equilibrium level of income that comes about because of expansionary fiscal policy is going to be less than predicted by the multiplier because the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So we don't get the entire increase in income at a given price level that's predicted by the multiplier and given by the horizontal difference between the two aggregate demand curves before and after the increase in government spending. We're going to get a smaller increase in income because the aggregate supply curve is increased. So part of the fiscal policy results in an expansion of income, but also an increase in the price level in the economy. That concludes our discussion of fiscal policy in the video tutorials. Make sure that you carefully look over your readings in the textbook, as well as take a look at the instructor commentary and the relevant appendices in the textbook that deal with the algebraic model that we've been discussing here right now. That concludes our discussion. Again, this is Professor Patrick Martin, and we'll see you in the next video tutorial.